When I accepted this invitation, I was a professor and department head at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And so I was figuring I'd have to fly down here and spend a couple days. But along the way, unbeknownst to me at that time, that I'm switched and I'm back at Rice. I had been gone for 8 years. I had been in Chicago. So I came in the middle of the summer, and it was about 105. I remember my wife couldn't come with me initially. I took a picture, sent it to her. Here's the temp. It was over 100 every single day this summer. So if any of you are from here, you know that. It just was like a heat dome that wouldn't go away, even for Houston. So that it's only 95 today, it feels like butter. That's how I say it. All right. Came back today. I had been out of town, and I was at Rice. One of the things that changed in my 8 years gone is that we went from one coffee shop on campus to like 5 now. So I went and tried a new one, and I asked, how much is a cup of coffee here? And they said, $2.75. I said, that's not bad. How much is a refill? And they said, well, that's free. I said, great, I'll have a refill. And it was a student run, and they didn't know what to do with that, so. I went, when I was in Chicago, I went to a local elementary, and the teacher was trying to do 2 things. 1, to inspire her students, and 2, to teach them a little bit about poetry. So I want to describe what I saw there. She wanted to teach them that in terms of what you do, you got to plan if you want to be something in life, and you have to think you can do it, as well as relying on the Lord, right? These were sitters, so this is where her instructions. She says, I want you to talk about what you want to do when you grow up and put it into what we call poetry or verse. So here's the instructions. It's just going to be 4 lines long. They're 6th graders after all. First line's really easy. Just say your name. Second and third line, describe what you want to be and perhaps how you'll do it. And then the 4th line, everybody's line is the same. You say, I think I can. So first line, 4th line, they're set, easy. The creativity comes in lines 2 and 3, and then 1 more requirement. At least 2 of the lines have to rhyme. It doesn't matter which 2. So she gave them some time to work on it. And of course, then she said, I would like a few people to share what they wrote. As you can imagine, nobody wanted to share what they wrote. So she waited a little bit. There's a trick if you're a teacher. You count to 10. Same if you're a pastor, I imagine. And somebody will break because they don't like the silence. So a boy stood up and he said, my name is Pete. I want to be a professional athlete. To do so, I'll have to eat lots of veggies and meat. I think I can. Well, the teacher was very happy with that. That's exactly what we're talking about. Thank you, Pete. Hey, wonderful. Can anybody else? Anybody else? A little less time waiting, and a young girl stood up. Hello, my name is Sadie. When I grow up, I want to be a business lady, get married, and have some babies. I think I can. Well, it was hardly any break at all, and another boy stood up and he said, my name is Dan. I was thinking that I'd want to live in Japan, but I think I'll stay here and help Sadie with her plan. I think I can. Oh, yeah. Even in 6th grade. All right, so I share this story because just like in Dan's case here, sometimes we have to recalculate. We have to understand the changing times and be able to adjust to them and figure out exactly what that recalculation is. So specifically at the end of the talk, I'm going to return to that. And even more specifically, if you come to the workshop tomorrow, and I think it's at 1 o'clock, I'll go into much more detail. So this evening I want to describe, in just a few minutes, name a reality that I think is impacting us all. And as I was listening to the songs, as I was listening to you speak, I'm hearing it. It's sort of like a monster, the elephant in the room, that I want to talk about. So the book Divided by Faith was mentioned, and in that book, which was written 23 years ago, ultimately we are arguing that religion is racialized, that the expressions of religion get shaped, even the same faith, Christianity, gets shaped by our racial background, at least in the US. And so we look at the impacts of that on the church. Well, my colleagues and I wanted to follow that up to see if anything has changed in the 20 or so years since the book came out. So we, with the help of, the Lilly Endowment, we got a grant, started in 2018 and been working on it ever since. Basically finishing now, as we have finished our book project on it, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I just wanted to quickly describe what we did and then talk very briefly about what we found. So if you could go back to the previous slide. Thank you. Junia, by the way, is running my slides, so thank you. Because apparently I can't do this. So. So first thing that we did is that we wanted to form a diverse, nationally representative collaboration team. These were scholars, religious practitioners, Christian leaders. So it was about 300 of them. And so any future step that we did, we were always getting their advice, getting their input. And as you can imagine, when 300 people tell you what you should do, it takes a little while to sift through and figure out what you should do. But they were incredibly helpful. So one of the first things we did, and if you could go to the next slide, is we went around the country and we talked to many of these folks as well as some others. Mostly Christian leaders of color, some white Christian leaders as well. And we filmed them, and I've got a couple pictures here of what it would look like when we did it. So my co-investigator is the man, let's see, would be on your, so it's the left picture, the man on the right, Glenn Bracey. He's a professor at Villanova. He did every interview. We interviewed hundreds of people all around the country. But to keep it consistent, he did them all. The man standing up in that picture was our project director, and he is the author of the book that was just handed out. And that book, Faithful Anti-Racism, came from this project. So we always started with just one question. We had all kinds of questions, but we almost never got past the first question, which was, tell us how you see the state of race and the church today. Now, keep in mind, this is starting in 2018. We did this round probably 2018, 2019, so that's the time frame. Because these folks had a lot of knowledge, we really never got past that question, and they would talk quite a bit, and we learned quite a bit. So from what we learned, and we studied what they had to say, that's why we filmed it. If you go to the next slide. We then created a national survey where we got repeated input from those 300 collaborators. I mean, right down to how do you ask a question about what racial background are you? I remember we went around and around and around because people had all kinds of opinions of what you should ask, but that was so helpful. We ultimately ended up interviewing or surveying 2,889 randomly selected adult Americans. Random in one sense it wasn't, is that we wanted half of the people to be Christian so that we had enough to analyze and compare. So that's how that broke down. We followed that up with a lot of analysis, and then we did focus groups where we were trying to understand what was the data that we found. We'd go and talk to people about it. And these now weren't the leaders, but the people in the pews. We followed that up with what we call ethnography. So you see all these dots. This is where we would embed ourselves in churches just to see how race and religion intertwine or don't in these congregations, usually spending 3 or more months there, and then keeping very detailed notes of that. And then also we did extensive literature reviews and things like that of anything we could find. Okay, lots of detail. Let's go on to the next slide. So ultimately we created this. The RJU project was our research, the RJUC, the Racial Justice and Unity Center. And Chad Brennan, who runs this, we've done a lot of work using our data to create churches, see where they're at in terms of race in the church. So it's free to take. Individuals can take it. The church as a whole can take it. Leadership can take it. And then there are coaches that have been trained to work with churches if there are areas that show in need of improvement. Okay? So that's kind of one outcome of that. All right. Let's go to the next slide. And stay right there. No clicking yet, Junia. All right. I told you that in Divided by Faith, we looked at how religion is racialized. What I want to talk about tonight is the flip side, how race has become religionized. And that's the thing that is deeply hurting us right now in our nation. So I'm just saying it now, but we'll go into it some tonight and even more tomorrow, how race is religionized. Okay. And until we can name that, we're not going to be able to diagnose what's happening in our nation, and we're not going to be able to find the antidotes to it, right? So, my colleague and I have a book coming out next year, and we're going to make an argument in that book. It's coming out in April. Yeah, if you could go to the next, just click. Okay, so just let me summarize. When we talked to those folks in those interviews around the country, we heard a lot of Christian leaders of color in particular had a lot of hope that things were moving in a positive direction in the church along racial lines around 2005, especially 2008. You remember a certain election and who got elected president of the United States, and there was hope. Okay. But then, next slide, the gut punch. And they would all communicate this, so I'm just relaying what they said. 2016 and that election and then the events that followed, to them were like ripping all that hope away in one fell swoop. A lot of pain, some left the whole movement, some are trying to figure out where they fit. A lot expressed real hurt by white Christians, feeling like they were thrown under the bus, that it mattered more to white Christians that they were white than that they were Christian. That's a common theme we heard. Okay, next slide, or next click. So the question that we have in the book is, why does racism and racial injustice not go away? It doesn't. It has been here since our nation was founded. It can ebb and flow. It takes on different forms, but it's always here. Why? Okay, next. Our argument is that because racism and racial injustice are the life-giving force, they're the Dracula's blood of an alternative religion, a major sect within Christianity itself, that has to have racism and racial injustice to thrive, survive, grow, okay? Okay, next. And so this is where we come with this idea that race is religionized. And then last on this slide, a thing that was very much a theme across all of our study is how deeply damaging this is, really ripping apart our country, creating incredible trauma for people. And it gets like, because it doesn't really get named, you get a lot of people feeling like they have done something wrong, or that they're somehow not Christian enough, but I'll come back to that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is the book that's coming out, and so I'm just going to summarize the argument, and of course I can't do justice in a few minutes, but just to give you a sense. Okay. We're going to argue, and we do argue, that there's an idol, or what we claim an alternative non-Christian religion, what we call the religion of whiteness, that coexists in many, many Christian churches, sometimes attempting to be synchronous with Christianity itself, but even more often, dominating and superseding historical Christianity. Not just in our churches, in our Christian colleges, in our Christian organizations. It's everywhere. So within a few minutes here, I just want to outline this. We'll go into, again, more detail on tomorrow. Okay. For a long time, I was very convinced, and we heard this from a lot of Christian leaders, that if we could do two things. One, teach people what the Bible had to say about racial injustice and reconciliation and unity. And two, if people could have contact with diverse people, then we could actually move towards Martin Luther King, right, and the beloved community, the idea of beloved community. But I've come to see that there's something much more sinister at play. We're not dealing with mere ignorance. We're not dealing with a mere lack of exposure to diverse others. So let me illustrate. I'm just going to do 2 data points for you today. to illustrate this. So if you could go to the next slide. I will use this term over and over again. So in 2000, we found that evangelicals were different from like mainliners, Catholics, and everything. But I actually say that in an odd way, evangelicals have won. And that, in some of the worst practices of evangelicals, and there are many good things, but in some of the worst, it is now practicing Christians in general that have adopted those. So that there's no longer a distinction, at least in our data, nor in some other fellow people that are studying it in their data. Those distinctions don't matter anymore. What matters is are you a practicing Christian or not? So how do we define that? If you click, 3 things. They have to say, I'm a Christian. 2, they have to say, my faith is very important to me. So if they say I'm a Christian, but I don't really care about it, then they're not a practicing Christian. And then, at least in our definition. And then 3rd, they have to attend at least monthly. So they're actually involved in a community to some extent. Now, most people that are in this definition are actually attending weekly, but we extended it a bit to monthly. Okay, so that's the category. And it doesn't matter, again, if we're talking about Catholic, mainline, evangelical, Orthodox. This is the category that matters. Okay, next slide. We asked in our first survey in 2019, do you think that the country has a race problem? Just very simple. And you can say definitely, maybe, no. You had 3 choices. Here's the percent agreeing. I'm only going to, just for simplicity right now, do 2 groups. And for some reason, they're not all showing up. But first group, practicing white Christians, 38% in 2019 thought we had a race problem, compared to 78% of African Americans, and in roughly the same percent of Hispanic, of Asian, and so on. So for simplicity, I'm just giving you 2 groups right now. But as you know, this is 2019, late summer 2019. Then George Floyd, and then all kinds of things. So we thought, oh my word, I wonder how things have changed. Have they changed? So we did the survey again, late summer, a year later. Here's what we found for those groups. So as you would expect, right, African Americans even more said, there's a problem. And every other group, including non-Christian whites, said in the 2020, there's a problem in bigger numbers than did in 2019. But one group was different, practicing white Christians. So it went from 38% to 30%. If you can click one more. We had a huge gap in 2019, 40 percentage points, but it became massive, 57 percentage points between these 2 groups, Christians now, right, practicing the same faith, over this year. What we have here is what we predicted, actually. We call it the epistemology of ignorance. It isn't ignorance, it's willful ignorance. Epistemology is how we come to know, and this is how we come to not know. And it is an incredible defense mechanism to say it isn't a problem. So the more it's a problem, only one group will use this. White practicing Christians will say, no, it's not. And a bigger percent, as it becomes a bigger problem, evident by what's on TV and on the internet, will simply say, it isn't a problem. That way you don't have to deal with it. Okay. Well, we're talking about Christians after all, so we were very curious. If you kind of pitted some Bible verses that might make you choose between your racial group and probably the original intent of the meaning of the verse, which would you choose? So, first question we asked to get to our questions I'm going to describe in a moment is, should the Bible be used to determine what is right and wrong? Only if they said yes, always. So they're saying, hey, the Bible is the Word, and I determine what is right and wrong by what the Bible says. So I'm only going to look at those folks. If they said that, then we ask these next 4 questions, okay? In the system of laws that God gave the Israelites to follow, there were laws that protected, does it show more? Well, that's weird. Huh. Okay, well, it protects foreigners and immigrants, strangers, all right, when they come into a new land. So what we do is then we just we just restate it. Therefore, it is good for Christians to protect foreigners and strangers. Another one. In the Bible, the prophet Nehemiah confessed sins committed by himself, his nation, and his ancestors. Therefore, it is good to confess sins committed by me, my nation, and my ancestors. Third question. The first Christians listened to the complaints of an ethnic minority group that was being treated unjustly. And for some reason, we're not going to see the rest, but you know from Acts 6, what did they do? They appointed leaders from that oppressed group and said, you know best, you take care of it. So then we repeat basically that verse and say, therefore it is good to do that. All right, fourth question. In the Bible, the Apostle Paul taught that people should not use unwholesome words, therefore it is good or bad. Therefore it is bad to use unwholesome words. All right, this is our control question. It's different than the other three. If you'll go to the next. Notice that the first three are about either how we should act towards other groups or confessing my own group's sin. My own group has fallen short. Whereas the last question is about personal piety. It's about individual action and not a group kind of thing. All right, so what did we find? We looked at all sorts of different racial groups by being Christian, practicing Christian or not. And here's what we found. If you click again. So for the first three questions, the majority of African Americans, Hispanics, so on, strongly agreed. That's what the Bible says. But only a third of practicing white Christians who could only get those questions if they told us the Bible must always be used to determine right or wrong, agreed with the Bible verses. Okay, what about the fourth question? This is why we had a control. There was no difference. And what we found is that's the one question where the majority of white Christians agreed as well. So for Christian groups, all strongly agreed with every question, except for practicing white Christians when it was about other groups or confessing the sin of their own group. So we wanted to know more. We didn't stop there, because you could have all different interpretations, and many of you, you know exegesis, just a verse, you'd want to know what comes before it, what comes after it. And so in the survey itself, if they didn't agree, we asked them why, and then a lot of them wrote that. Sometimes they got kind of nasty and said something like, the Bible doesn't say illegals can come into your country and things like that. But we went and did those focus groups. We talked to people, sat in circles and talked. We made them race specific, so all Hispanic or all white. So usually people are freer to talk then. Lots of people in all the groups said, well, you really got to know the context, what comes before and what comes after. That makes sense. So we didn't think anything of it until we went back and watched the film. And what we found was when non-white groups, people of color, those groups said that, they'd either pull out their Bibles or their apps and start looking at it and discussing it. But when the white Christian groups said that, they didn't open their Bibles. They didn't look for the context. It was a defense to not have to agree with the verse. And that was it. Okay. So again here, we're not dealing with biblical ignorance. We're dealing with willful biblical ignorance. Okay? Next slide. So what is going on? Why? And this is, again, our answer. I've already said how we're naming it. Go ahead. We are calling it a distortion to Christianity or an alternative religion, the religion of whiteness. Okay? So what is the religion of whiteness? By the way, we did all kinds of empirical tests, how they answered questions. We did something fancy that Junie would only know, called latent class analysis, that takes and looks at all the data at once and puts people into groups based on how they respond to all the questions. And it put 2/3 of white Christians into one group, this group that is practicing this thing called the religion of whiteness. And that's exactly what we found when we analyzed each question over and over again. So you're talking about millions upon millions of practicing white Christians. 1/3 are somehow avoiding this religion of whiteness, but 2/3 are buying into it, right? Okay, what is it? So let's talk about what it is. All right, one more click. Okay, fancy definition, then I'll explain it. A unified system of beliefs and practices that venerates and sacralizes, or just, you could say, worships whiteness, while declaring profane everything else. It's that simple. That's the religion of whiteness. So if anything you do, you represent, that isn't supporting whiteness, you are profane, according to this religion. Next. So another way to think about it is it's a disfiguring of historical Christianity, so much so that it can be viewed as a competing religion. And we have many examples in the Bible. It's akin to simultaneously worshiping, say, the God of the Hebrews and foreign gods. I asked my son, who is an ordained pastor, to do a systematic exploration of the Bible and say, does the Bible ever accept synchronism? Can you do that? Well, as you probably know, that is never okay. So if you give it the most charitable definition, it's just kind of like combining two things, but they're not allowed to be combined biblically. So that's where we have a problem. Okay, next slide. That's the big question. Well, what is this thing, whiteness? The simple definition is just white people and supporters of other hues. You don't have to be white. White people's dominance, that's it. That's what whiteness is. White people and their dominance. Okay, I'll give you a little bit of elaboration here. It's to imagine, right, that white, we often say is right, but white is the norm. It's the standard by which everything else is compared. And it's the power that white civilization, be it Europe, be it North America, wherever, has experienced for centuries and centuries. That's what gets worshipped. That's what gets felt. That's what is defended. Next slide. I keep thinking people are getting up to leave because they're offended, but they're getting up to take pictures, so I appreciate that. I gave a talk similar to undergrads at Villanova, and they were mostly white. And yeah, by the time I was done, half were gone, so that's always interesting. All right. If we're going to say it's a religion, we've got to, at least as a sociologist, we have very specific definitions of what religion is. So we say all religions have sacred symbols. So you have an ultimate that you're worshiping, but you worship the ultimate through your symbols that are actually worldly and you can tangibly see them. And then all religions have beliefs and they have practices. And then usually those things are carried out and passed on to the next generation through a social organization, churches, radio stations, whatever it might be, podcasts. All right, let's look at what the sacred symbols are for the religion of whiteness. Go ahead. There's 3. White Jesus, and we're going to talk about why that's so important. The merging of the cross and the flag, and growing in importance, firearms. Okay, next. All right, this is Jesus. Every one of them is Jesus. Next slide. This is not Jesus, not in the religion of whiteness. What this is, at its best, is silliness. At its worst, and the most common interpretation from the religion of whiteness, this is blasphemy. Of course, Jesus didn't look like any of these representations, couldn't have. Jesus must be white. Okay? And then we see so many times in so many churches, right, the cross and the flag, and we even put the flag over the cross, until, in the next slide, they become the same thing. And whenever I show this picture, I always say where it comes from. This is my in-laws' front yard. And in my father-in-law's study, he has a picture of Donald Trump praying, and he basically says the prayer that Donald Trump has given. So there you go, practitioner of the religion of whiteness. Okay, next. Okay, and then you can find so many. So it's a big seller. Somehow, I have to tell you this. I'm on Donald Trump Jr.'s mailing list, and Donald Trump Jr. emails me at least once a week, and he's always selling me stuff. And the thing he's trying to sell me are things like this: faith, family, faith, friends, flags, firearms, 5 things you don't mess with. You don't effing mess with our. That's basically what they're saying. Okay? Look at Jesus cradling his M16 or whatever that is. Family photo for Christmas. You know, some of you might know the name Jamar Tisby, and we were talking recently, and he said that when the Ku Klux Klan reinvigorated in the early 1900s, they went to Stone Mountain, Georgia, went up, and they laid down three things. They put an open Bible, they had the flag, and instead of these firearms, they laid a sword. So it hasn't changed a whole lot, but it's just been modernized, okay? And then ultimately, all of this gets merged into, again, think of it, race becomes religionized. Jesus, this white figure, is ultimately Uncle Sam. Yeah. Okay? Now, I won't go into a whole lot of detail, but just to give you a sense. So the 6 beliefs that we identify and what we do in the book is that we test for each of these to see if they really do exist. And we find, of course, support that they do. So one, no surprise, is a commitment to whiteness. And we'll see that people rarely will call it a commitment to whiteness. But tomorrow I'll tell you about a group that does, but we'll see why they mostly don't. Next. Here's where we know it's not a Christian religion. God is on the side of the dominant group, the world's winners. So you know that God is with you because he has blessed you with power and resources. And my brother lives in a very fancy neighborhood. He married a multimillionaire female woman, and whenever we drive in, my father would say, "And here, my son, are where the winners live." Right? Because they're all $1 million plus homes, and well, that's the dominant group idea. God has blessed us because we have done it the right way. Okay. This is just so important, and I have to credit my current grad student, Elijah Jong. Whiteness is universal. So, whiteness is normative, it's unseen, and here's the key. Jesus is universal. Jesus for everybody. We all know that. Even in the religion of whiteness, Jesus for everybody. But Jesus is white. We already established that. That's who we worship. Therefore, just drop Jesus and drop Jesus from the first sentence there and the second sentence. What do you got? What you're left with is the universal is white, and white is universal. So I don't ever have to proclaim my whiteness because whiteness has won. It is universal. Everything else is a sideshow. Okay? Therefore, without ever having to name whiteness, you get to center white understandings, theologies, values, actions, and they are instead argued to be universal. So if you were to try to do, I don't know, Hispanic theology, it's a side thing. It's not like real theology, right? So those kind of things are always de facto inferior or questionable or just for a niche of people. White Christian nationalism, that's been in the news a lot. This is one of the beliefs. So it's a fusion of Christian symbols, kind of morphed, as we've seen, with American civic life. So it's an allegiance to an American identity, but read it as allegiance to a white identity. And then finally, and we're very specific on this, a doctrine of black inferiority. So the main foil is African Americans in this religion, but then it creates confusion for every other group because they are other, they're not white, but where are they? What are they? And they get busy competing with each other, and this benefits the religion of whiteness as there can be infighting between these groups, and they don't have to worry about them. Okay, and there's 5 practices. And again, we test for all of these. One of the first 2, I've given you examples. Highly selective use of Christian biblical scriptures. So folks will say they interpret the Bible literally until it violates the religion of whiteness. They interpret it a different way. Second is this epistemology of ignorance, how people come to not know. It's one of its practices. And then third, veneration of the sacred symbols in so many ways. Showed you a few photos, but it goes on in so many details that it becomes ingrained in culture. Actively protecting whiteness. Tomorrow I'll talk some about how that happens. But if whiteness gets threatened, like it did in 2020, there will be a very coordinated white lash led by practitioners of this religion of whiteness. And then fifth, opposing Christians of color, and we found whites who do not subscribe to this religion. So we have a whole chapter on white folks who decide they're not going to practice this religion and what happens to them. And it's very similar to what happens to Christians of color. So some of the things that happen, right, is people question your faith. Are you with us? Are you not? Are you a believer? Have you left the fold? You get marginalized, you get belittled, you get labeled unchristian, heretic, enemy of God, you name it. Okay, next slide. All right, so we're wrapping up here. What do we do in this context then? What are we supposed to do? How would we work for biblical justice when we're talking about this behemoth of a thing? All right, we go here. So I got here today, just like a lot of you probably did if you drove here, used the GPS on my phone. And the brilliant thing about the GPS, right, is you put in the address of where you're going, it typically already knows where you are, and it maps out supposedly the best route to get you there. There's some exceptions where it doesn't give you the best route, but we've probably all experienced it. Okay, so what I think is the most brilliant, though, about this is, if it says go 6 blocks north and then take a left, and I go 5 blocks south and take a right, it doesn't say, you imbecile. You know what it says. It says recalculating. And it just very patiently just keeps, wherever you are, just keeps trying to tell you, here's the best way to the unchanging destination, right? So I think that's where we are, and this is what I want to focus on tomorrow, that we have to do some recalculation. We already know the destination. So as we know where we are now, we can figure out how to get to that destination. It's a little different route than maybe we wanted to use in the past. So I'm actually going to end here, but I'm going to ask you to kind of think about these questions because we'll talk about them tomorrow if you are here. Do we work for justice separately by race or together? And if we did it together, how are we going to do that? How are we going to actually structure that, given the inequalities that exist in society? And then what story is to be told and who will tell it? I loved the first song that we did. I loved all the songs, but the first song was, when are we going to sing a new song? This is how we end our book, too. When are we going to tell a new story and who's going to tell it? So we'll talk about that. And I thank you so much and so glad you're here and look forward to seeing you again tomorrow.